All right, Chapter 4, the social demography of health, focusing on gender, age, and race. Chapter 3, we looked at social class hierarchies. In this chapter, we'll be looking at gender hierarchies, age hierarchies, and race hierarchies, and how they affect health. Starting with gender. All right, between 1961 and 1983, we didn't see any declines in life expectancy anywhere in the country. It's good news, right? However, after 1983, the loss of longevity for females in certain low-income countries and counties emerged and is counter to past trends. So what does all this mean? In more recent decades, we're starting to see a slowdown, and even in more recent years, a reversal in this long-term trend towards longer and longer lifespans, with women actually taking the lead as far as the reductions. Now, in pre-industrial societies, life expectancy for men and women was similar. Now, however, since 1850, women made greater gains in life expectancy and today outlive men in all but a few countries. Changes in work and family circumstances in the 70s and a convergence between men and women in lifestyles means that the gap between men and women is narrowing. So, currently, women certainly do live longer than men by a few years, 4 or 5 years on average, depending which year we're talking about here. But that gap is certainly not getting any wider, and in a lot of ways has been shrinking for some time. That said, male death rates still exceed those of females at all stages, and for the leading causes of death, such as heart disease, cancer, cerebrovascular diseases, strokes, accidents, and pneumonia. Male inferiority in life expectancy has both biological and social components, which is evidenced by higher mortality rates even at the prenatal and neonatal stages. See, at that point, the social components aren't really there. This is something that is a biological hardwire that results in male fetuses and male babies being more fragile than their female counterparts. That's why, to a large degree, there were slightly more male babies born than female babies. It's kind of nature's way of correcting for the fact that the men just don't live quite as long, or more likely to die, I should say, every year of life. Now, the social parts of all of this include things like accidents, aggressive and risky behavior, and occupational stress on the part of men, resulting in lower life expectancies. Now, men generally have a higher rate of mortality, as we've established, but women appear to have a higher morbidity rate. Morbidity refers to illness. So, women are more likely to have chronic conditions that are not a leading cause of death, except for diabetes. Men have more of the chronic problems that do end your life. So, what we're left with here is a scenario where men don't live as long, but they're also spend fewer years of their lives sick. Women, on the other hand, live longer, but spend more of their lives sick. Now, part of what drives all this is smoking. Some 440,000 Americans die each year from smoking-related diseases. That's not just cancer. That includes things like strokes and COPD and, I know I'm forgetting several, emphysema, things like this that, do kill. The current trend in the U.S. is toward a decrease in smoking, thankfully, for both sexes. However, the rate of male smokers began declining earlier and faster than women. So that's part of the reason why we're starting to see this closing of the gap, right? Men got on board the quitting smoking train a little bit earlier and did so in greater numbers, and as a result, their life expectancy has improved. Now, women still, their rates of smoking still decline, but not as quickly. So while their life expectancies also improved, they didn't improve as quickly. Now, so when it comes to mental health, no consistent differences really between men and women in clinically diagnosed cases, number of cases of mental illness, except it's the type of mental illness that seems to manifest. It does differ between the sexes. Women have higher rates of depressive and anxiety disorders, whereas men have more personality disorders. They note here that marriage and employment carry mental health benefits for both men and women. Employment, certainly. Marriage it's kind of a mixed bag when you really look at the research. I think overall, I think the book is correct. If you look at all the research that's out there, yes, it's beneficial for everybody. But there's a pretty good chunk of the research that's been done, at least some of the older stuff, that showed that getting married was actually bad for women, in that they died younger if they got married. So take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. All right, we'll move on from gender. We'll go to age. Now, the current cohort of the elderly. Cohort refers to a group of people born in a particular time. So the people who are born, early enough to be considered old now, that's that cohort. So I guess right now we're looking at, the end of World War II, that cohort are moving into retirement. And the folks who were born then and during the Korean War, people born in that period are now heading towards retirement. So they'd be what we call the elderly at this point. Them and everybody older than them. Now, the current cohort, the ones who are just moving into elderly status now, are healthier, they're better educated, and they're more affluent than past cohorts. If you think of it in terms of comparing them to their parents, it's not really too surprising, right? These are folks who came of age during the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, during times when these great advances in medicine and health and all these things were going forward. More people went to college. There was more money. There were many more years removed from the Depression. All these other things. So, yes, they're healthier. They're more well educated, and they have more money. They also have increased political power to influence relevant legislation, such as Social Security and Medicare, largely because of their numbers. The baby boom generation. I'm sure you guys have heard of them, right? This is this group that is now heading into retirement, and it's a very, very large number. Hence the word boom. With those numbers come political power. Now, although these folks are healthier, right, there's so darn many of them that they're going to place greater demand on the healthcare delivery systems going forward. So we'll have to ride out about a 20, 30-year period where we're going to have a disproportionate number of elderly folks in our society as a result of this baby boom, this anomalous birth cohort. Now, most elderly, as far as their health goes, they're rated as good, despite the fact that health does tend to deteriorate with advancing age. So, why is that? Well, this suggests two important points about self-rated health. First, whenever anybody is asked their health, not just the elderly, but anybody else, people tend to compare themselves to others who are similar in age and sex. So the elderly, even though their health has been declining, they're generally comparing themselves to their friends, their cohorts, whose health has also been declining. The question is, relatively speaking, who is healthier? So that's why you get these pretty positive self-rated health reports from elderly patients. It also shows that health is perceived in terms of ability to function. Older adults generally have reduced daily activities, right? They don't have to do as much as the rest of us, compared to the young adults like us. You guys, I'm kind of in the middle. Thus, poor health is less likely to be viewed as disruptive. For example, if you have no reason to walk a mile at any point in your day, at any point, the fact that you can't walk a mile doesn't really strike you as a big deal. Whereas, if your job involves a good amount of walking, say you have to walk several miles a day, being unable to walk a mile would be a big deal. So it's the deficit between capacity and demand that is at play here. All right, race. Now, race is always a difficult topic to discuss in terms of medical things because there's a lot going on. When we talk about race, remember, any good sociologist will tell you the whole concept is really it is a social construction. Race is more of a social variable than it is a biological one. However, race here, the definition, or why it makes it so tricky, is that it's the convergence of biological factors with geographic origins, multiple cultural, economic, political, and legal variables, and there you go. Put all of that into a mix, and then you get race. The whole idea of genetically distinct races is more propaganda than, reality. We'll start by talking about black Americans. Significantly, more blacks than whites have hypertension. That's really the big story here. African Americans live many years fewer than white Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. All right, Native Americans even. Well, depends on which Native American group. But there's a very shortened life expectancy there by many years. And there's a lot of reasons that are given for this. Now, the first one is always thrown out there as genetic predisposition, primarily for hypertension, right? And there is some evidence to suggest that is true, that there is a genetic predisposition to hypertension. But then we move into other things, like physical exertion, where this is more of a social thing, obviously, this is biological, where African Americans are more likely than whites to be engaged in manual labor. Now, the thing about manual labor, you think, oh man, 8 hours of exercise a day, that must be great for you. Well, it's not quite the same as spending a couple of hours at Orange Theory or whatever. Backbreaking manual labor actually has a deleterious effect on health over time. At least it certainly can. Now, there's also associated disorders that can cause hypertension. Diabetes comes to mind. Other things, kidney diseases, other metabolic issues. All of these things are associated disorders, which African Americans are more likely to have than their white or Hispanic or Asian counterparts. Also on the list is psychological stress from racial discrimination. There's actually a pretty good amount of literature out there that supports this. It's the so-called weathering hypothesis by an author named, I want to say, Geronimus. Where, again, it's not just any particular incident. It's not like, oh, somebody followed me in a store, now I'm going to die next month. It's a little more subtle than all that, but what it is more of the cumulative effect of this stuff over the course of a lifetime. The fact that there's very few reprieves. There's always this constant feeling of hostility from the group in power, white folks, that results in this long-term psychological stress. Other explanations given are dietary patterns. Dietary patterns for African Americans, much like those for working class whites and poor whites, leave a bit to be desired when it comes to heart health. Now, a part of that, of course, has to do with socioeconomic stuff, but we'll get there in a minute. And finally, we get to poorer medical care. Even when there is access to medical care, the quality of the care is not the same. So we have poverty, marginal employment, low incomes, segregated living conditions, which I haven't really touched on yet, but it's certainly a part of this, and inadequate education are more common among blacks than whites and are features of socioeconomic stratification that we saw in Chapter 3, which is known to cause poor health. And that's really kind of the take-home message here. When it comes to race, you can't really separate race and class. The two things are very much tied together. And then you start throwing gender into the mix. Then you have what is referred to as the intersectionality of all of this. There's your sociology buzzword, right? Intersectionality, meaning there's multiple hierarchies that people occupy. That's why a lot of folks understand when some of these terms get tossed around, things like white privilege. And then you find a poor white guy who's like, I don't feel very privileged. Well, that's because the idea of white privilege is being thrown out there without all the other stuff that's out there. Race is part of it, class is part of it, and gender is part of it. And where you reside on these three hierarchies, that's what determines your overall social position. Now, African Americans are lower in the overall racial hierarchy, but also are overrepresented in the lower social class hierarchy. So it's kind of a double threat. And that's why we do see these disparate health outcomes that been seeing for decades and don't seem to be abating anytime soon. So that's kind of that's why chapters 3 and 4 should really be kind of taken together. It's a mistake to try to parse out, nope, it's just a social class thing, or no, it's just a race thing. It's called reductionism, and you don't really want to do that. The fact is, these things have been tied together historically, contemporarily, and likely into the future for some time. So tying them together is important. Now, other things to note, blacks are more segregated than other racial and ethnic groups in American society. Other groups tend to live interspersed amongst one another and amongst white folks. Black Americans tend to live in homogeneously black neighborhoods. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. Many of them well-documented historical issues. Now, a number of sexual contacts, part of the reasons why there's a problem with the segregated neighborhoods is it leads to higher rates of STDs. A higher number of sexual contacts between an infected core of individuals in these black neighborhoods and the uninfected periphery tends to contain the infection within the black population. That's why there's higher rates of HIV in the black population. It's not so much, one group has more or less unprotected sex or, risky sex or anything like that. It has more to do with, again, these kind of large level population issues where there's just not a lot of intermingling of this black population with the rest of the population. All right, Hispanic Americans. There's a few things in your book about all this, but I guess we'll focus on the Hispanic paradox, which is that Hispanics have lower mortality rates than non-Hispanic whites at most ages. This is in spite of the fact that they have lower socioeconomic status and are much less likely to have health insurance. It's counterintuitive, right? They're poorer, they don't have insurance, yet they're living longer. Now, part of that is that the population is younger than other racial groups, is part of the explanation. But there's other explanations too. One of them that I've always found to be the most convincing, your mileage may vary, but what I've always found the most convincing is when we start talking about the Hispanic population, there's a good number of immigrants, legal and illegal, but immigrants, right? Now, when you immigrate from a country to another country, is that something you do when you're very old? Generally not, unless you're going there to follow your kids. Generally, the large numbers of folks who do come over here, the majority of immigrants are young. When I say young, I mean children. I mean young adults, people in their 20s, 30s, even 40s. These folks don't have real major health issues yet. Most people don't. Most people make it into their 50s before things start breaking down. So you have kind of an overrepresentation of fit, healthy, young folks. Even the young folks who aren't healthy, they're not the ones who come over here. They just stay where they are because, well, they're not healthy enough to make it. Other reasons that have been put out there in the literature are dietary ones. The diets for Hispanic populations tend to be higher in fiber than your average American diet, which results in lower rates of colon cancers, heart diseases, a few other things, and so folks live longer. What's interesting about that, and kind of the evidence for it, is that first and second generation folks experience this Hispanic paradox, but then once they start to get to third generation, fourth generation, it goes away because they become acculturated into American society, eat the American diet, and the protection is gone. So they die just as quickly as the rest of us. So, Hispanics are more likely to be without a regular source of health care for a variety of reasons. I'm sure they list them in your book. Part of it is money, part of it is immigration status, part of it is the concentrations of these folks in rural areas. All right, Native Americans. Now, Native Americans in recent years have experienced a significant improvement in their overall level of health. But important problems remain. In particular, among this population, there are high rates of diabetes and mortality from diabetes, high rates of accidents, automobile and various other types, alcoholism and alcohol-related diseases, which also ties back to diabetes, and suicide. You see, all these things they're not all mutually exclusive ideas. All right, Asian Americans. We're kind of moving quickly here, but I think the slide shows long enough already. Overall, Asians and Pacific Islanders are the healthiest racial group in American society when mortality rates are considered. So they live the longest. Again, much like why blacks are the group that live the least amount of time, what we're seeing here is the importance of socioeconomic status. Again, having to include that into the mix. Asian Americans, even though Asian Americans certainly do deal with their fair share of discrimination and racial hatred and that kind of thing, they tend to have the highest levels of income, education, and employment of any racial or ethnic minority in the U.S. In a lot of ways, or in some data, that would show that they have higher rates of education and income than even the native-born white population. So it kind of mitigates whatever discriminatory acts that may be hurled in their direction.